Welcome to Check In with Jason Lortzen, where we explore how to create human, connected workplaces that employees love and that fuel organizational success. Each week, I invite someone who's leading the way in this work to join me for a conversation to both inspire and educate us. Today's guest is Will Matthews. Will is the Director of Learning and Engagement, also known as Team Hearts and Minds at G Adventures, where he helps craft ridiculously fun and deeply human leadership programs for a global team of adventurers. A former karma chameleon turned professor of culture, Will blends a love of learning with a techie past and a soft spot for sci-fi to build experiences that spark courage, connection, and growth. Will, thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Now, I have to say before we get started, that is one of the best bios I think anyone has ever sent me to read. So very well done on that. I was reading through that and I'm like, this is sassy. I like it. It's got some personality. So thank you.
My pleasure. No, it's a fair reflection of the culture we have at the company. So it works well.
That's good. Well, let's, as we always do, I like to start before we get into talking about your work with getting to know a little bit more about you. And so let's start very simply with asking if you would share a little bit more about the work you do and who you do it for.
Sure. So I work for a company called G Adventures. And so for those that aren't familiar, we're the world's largest independent adventure travel operator. When we talk about adventure travel these days, certainly we cut our teeth on backpacking and that sort of thing. And we still offer that sort of travel, but we also offer a lot of, as I like to think of it, more of a softer landing for people that are ready to kind of hang the backpack up a bit. And adventure really speaks to being able to step outside of the comfort zone and kind of get off the beaten path a little bit, as cliche as it is to say. And so we are pioneers in what we refer to as community tourism. So making sure that the travel itself is giving back to the communities that we visit. And we do that by ensuring that as much of the money that is spent on tour can stay in the region as possible. So we actually, if you go through our brochure or on the website, all of our trips come with what we refer to as a ripple score. And that is an indicator of sort of the percentage of the money that will remain in that community. And we're happy to say that the sort of average across all of our tours is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 95 to 100%. So wow. We're doing a lot of really important work there. And then we'll also work with a lot of community projects, call them, that are designed to be a value add to the tour and give a really cool experience to our travelers. So for example, maybe it's handicrafts or maybe it's a hostel or a restaurant, but we'll work with them to bring them travelers and they become a self-sustaining business. But then that way they're kind of developing their own sort of economic freedom by ensuring that, they're not just waiting for handouts from us and that sort of thing.
Interesting. And so tell me about your role in the organization, the work you do.
Sure. So you heard my official title is Director of Team Hearts and Minds. The unofficial title that I like to go with is Professor of Culture. And a lot of that comes from, I've spent a lot of time on the engagement side of things and even before we knew it was engagement. So you made reference to that karma chameleon title. We are very fortunate within the organization. The owner of the company, Bruce Poon-Tip, was looking to kind of go all in on culture within the business and said, look, I'm going to create a whole new department called Culture Club. Obviously, everybody that's a member is going to be referred to as a karma chameleon. Are you in? And I looked at him and I was like, what the heck are you talking about? But what we realized afterwards was, that culture and engagement piece that everybody's talking about these days. This was back in 2007 or so. And we were kind of ahead of the curve on that, which made it challenging to figure out sort of the path to take. But now that's kind of evolved into a pretty regular sort of stream of work within the organization. And my role now is to kind of connect the dots between growth and development from an employee experience perspective, but also making sure that that's well anchored in the culture and the experience of the organization to kind of bring it all together and create a workforce that's super motivated to do the work that we're doing.
We're going to talk more about your work here in a minute. So though we're definitely going to get a better feel for the kinds of things you do. But before I even ask you more about your work, I have to ask you more because I'm sure if I'm listening to this, I know my brain went to all kinds of, when I first heard about your business, I got really curious. So I'm curious, I'm sure you have probably been on some of these trips. I'm sure you're a consumer of your own product. What are an example or two of some really cool community tourism kinds of trips that you offer? What does a trip look like? I'm curious if you paint a picture of what kind of experience you create.
Sure. So, I mean, first and foremost, we want to recognize that we're building a vacation for people. And so we don't want people to have to sort of think about, am I giving back to communities? Should I be doing more? And that social side of things is kind of built into the work that we do on the back end. So the way that we kind of phrase it is we just want you to be able to show up and have the time of your life and trust that we've designed things in such a way that you're automatically going to be giving back. But to give you an example, so some of the work that we've done, we kind of were born out of a lot of tours in Latin America. And one of the longest running community projects that we've been working with is the Women's Weaving Co-op in Peru. So what we were noticing is a lot of people were leaving the small towns to go to cities like Lima to, follow the money where traveler money was kind of coming in. But that was leaving a lot of these local customs kind of high and dry because they weren't sticking around and sort of following in the traditions of how things work. But that's the whole reason that people show up in the first place. So it became kind of a catch-22. And so what we did is we started working with the Women's Weaving Co-op and said, we're going to bring you travelers. If you could, present the story and show how weaving is very much a part of the culture here and the storytelling of history and sort of just highlighting the richness of that local culture, then you'll be able to sell them handicrafts and garments and that sort of thing as sort of keepsakes. And that's one example of kind of what we did in that region. But then as things grew, we noticed that, one of the number one destinations in Peru is Machu Picchu. And so people will fly into Lima, generally transit all the way through this area called the Sacred Valley onto Machu Picchu and then do the Inca Trail hike there. The challenge is that there's a ton of tourism traveling through the Sacred Valley, but until we sort of got involved, nobody was stopping there. And so all of the locals were like, what the heck? We're not benefiting from all these people coming through our region. Mm-hmm. And so is there something we can do there? And so we worked with some local partners and created the Parwa Community Restaurant, where you can get some amazing local dishes, but they're also there to kind of help tell the story of the Sacred Valley. And it's all employing local people so that they can, be a part of that tourism experience. And they're so proud to show off their culture. They want to be involved, but sometimes the infrastructure just isn't there. And so we kind of help them set that infrastructure up. And then before long, they're quite self-sufficient and kind of take off in their own direction. So it's been fantastic there. But I mean, globally, we're aiming to have 300 projects by 2030. And so the goal really is to sort of be able to share that kind of experience with as many travelers as possible. And all they have to do is kind of show up and have an amazing time on tour.
Wow. I'm in. Now I'm anxious to go. So tell me about your workforce just quickly in terms of you have your obviously your workforce is spread out all over the world, but tell me about the size and kind of nature of your workforce.
Yeah, so we're distributed across, I would say, probably about 25, we'll call them points of presence. So that can vary anywhere from something enormous like our head office in Toronto, but then also have operations offices in Peru, in Bangkok, in South Africa. So we've got small offices, and then there's going to be one or two people kind of establishments that are just there to kind of help manage things as you kind of get further and further away from those more centralized offices. But we're looking at roughly, I would say, in the neighborhood of about 600 plus people in terms of what we would call back office staff, and then well over 1,000 tour leaders that we refer to as CEOs or chief experience officers. And they operate all over the place. It's very seasonal, obviously, as you can imagine. In some regions, there's not a lot of people traveling in some seasons over others. So that number will go up and down. But overall, we'd be looking at about 1,500 to, closing in on around 2,000 people globally if you take into account all of those people. And some of those individuals will never see the inside of an office. but others are, sort of office bound. And so we kind of joke saying, this whole return to office conversation, we've been doing sort of the remote work thing by necessity for a really long time. So we've been well situated to be able to sort of dive into those waters.
Sure. So I think you already answered this question, or at least you sort of hinted at when it happened or how it happened, perhaps. But how did you end up being in this work that you do today? What was the gateway into it? Was it that moment when your CEO came and said, "Hey, I'm starting the Culture Club. Do you want to be involved in this?" Or how did that transition happen for you?
Yeah, I would say probably even a little bit before that. I mean, I've always been somebody who likes to dabble in a bunch of different things. And so my formal training coming out of university was in something called human-computer interaction, which is kind of the grandfather to what would be referred to as UI UX these days, or that sort of thing. But it's a bit more all-encompassing to kind of ensure that humans are using computers as the tools rather than computers using humans as the tools. And so really understanding what that looks like. And as a result, I intended to go into sort of the multimedia universe, thinking that that was going to be an evergreen kind of thing with CD-ROMs back in the day, depending on how far back the listeners remember. But as a result, I started getting involved in things like video editing and audio design and stuff like that, having little jobs here and there. And as a result, I was able to take that experience with me into G Adventures. And that allowed me to kind of create more upscale presentations and that kind of thing for the owner of the company. And so that kind of put me on his radar to say, like, this guy's more, because I showed up as the IT guy. And yet here I was developing all this sort of content. And that really kind of sparked some interest in terms of co-developing some stuff. And we've been working off and on developing messaging for the business and that kind of thing. But that was kind of my first sort of step towards the non-tech side of things. And then as I kind of played in that space more and more, I realized, oh, well, if we're going to be all in on culture, we're going to need to make sure that we build that into training pieces. And then one thing led to another. And, now 23 years later, here I am being fully grounded in the talent side of things.
Sure. Well, and it seems, just as an aside, it seems that that training paired up with the culture work, the human, what did you call it?
Human-computer interaction.
Yeah, human-computer interaction paired up with culture work kind of set you up at the perfect intersection for an AI world we're emerging into, right? I mean, that's what we're all trying to sort out right now, it seems. So ideally suited. So as you think about the work you do today, Will, what is it that you love the most about your work?
I mean, honestly, it kind of boils down to the same things that I really enjoyed on the tech support side of things, and that is solving thorny problems and working with people. And I don't think that really occurred to me until I kind of made the leap. I always kind of labeled myself as a nerd. I still do. But at the same time, I really have enjoyed working with people. And now that I've had an opportunity to kind of build some programming and facilitate it from time to time to be able to see how it lands with people, being there for when they have their own aha moment and realize that they're capable of more than they sort of understood before taking a look at the content or going through the experiential learning, that's really rewarding for me. And so, the problems aren't as easy as just turn it on and off again and it should work fine. People aren't quite so straightforward. They tend to get a little antsy if you try. So, being able to sort of co-author solutions with people has been a real sort of eye-opener for me.
Well, speaking of people being a bit complicated and not quite as straightforward as the on-off switch, the conversation that we're going to talk about today is a really interesting one. And it's around a phrase or a label that you actually sort of brought up when we were talking that I don't know that I've necessarily heard a lot. So it piqued my ears. You said you'd kind of like to talk about reluctant leaders and how you're activating or working to kind of activate or invite reluctant leaders to step in or more fully into a different way of seeing themselves or kind of activating them at work. And that, which I found really fascinating. And then you shared that this is born out of an experience, a very specific experience that you had in your career that you said made you a reluctant leader for a long time. So I was wondering if we might start by you sharing that story.
Sure, yeah. So as I say, I kind of got my start on the IT side of things. And one of the things that becomes possible when you're an IT person, especially if you're doing desktop support and that sort of thing and visiting people's offices, is it's almost like you become a bit of the bartender experience where you just kind of, you listen to people's problems and you kind of talk through things. And what can also happen is if you're sitting around waiting for updates to finish or that sort of thing, people will go on about their daily lives while you're, trying to force a printer to start working or something like that. And so one such time I was in the office of somebody who had just recently promoted a number of people to leadership positions. And she was giving them a bit of a briefing. And one of the lines that she used, which very much stuck with me, was, so because of your promotion today, today's the day that I'm going to teach you how to be okay with being an asshole. And that kind of, I didn't really know how to react while I'm stuck in the room with these people. But at the same time, it really did stick with me. And it wasn't intended for me, but it did kind of get lodged in my brain to the point where I started questioning, did I actually want to follow the path that, these newly minted leaders were following? Because I don't really have any desire to be an asshole. And so for a really long time, I kind of stunted my career because I took that advice that I overheard to heart. And as a result, I not only did I sort of say no to a lot of promotion opportunities or growth opportunities, but I actually started talking to my managers and saying, like, please don't ever consider me for a manager role. And one of the things, like, to be clear, I'm definitely not a believer that you need to be a manager in order to be a leader. Anybody can be a leader, but certainly if you're going to be a manager, then you have to get that leadership stuff right. And so while I was saying out loud, I don't want to be a manager, really in the back of my mind, what I was thinking was, I don't really want to be an asshole. And so I kind of bowed out of that conversation. And it took me a really long time to kind of start to work up the courage to challenge that notion. And to be fair, like, nobody said that this is a universal, condition, but at the same time, it's really easy for people to kind of think of examples in their lives of managers or leaders that have kind of come through their lives where there's evidence to support that philosophy that, some managers might have behaved like assholes in their lives or that sort of thing. And so it's not hard to kind of codify that to some degree and say, like, oh yeah, no, that seems to be the case. And so finally, some time had gone by, and by now I was on the talent side of things, and I was still, despite being so close to a lot of this messaging, had kind of not really taken it in until we got to talking about an opportunity that we were going to be offering people for a leadership camp kind of an experience, and who would be eligible and who wouldn't be eligible. And I said, like, oh, okay, well, maybe if I start challenging this a little bit, we can kind of open the doors for more people and kind of avoid having certain managers saying, oh, I don't want my people to go simply because they felt that they were going to be threatened by, how these people were coming back or maybe they were insecure in their roles, what have you. And the VP of talent at the time had said, well, if you're this passionate about the topic, why don't you audit one of our leadership camps and take a look at that for yourself? And so I went, and one of the things that I noticed was we do a ton of self-assessment work in these kinds of things. And there was one self-assessment that talked about communication styles. And I mean, we kind of did a bit of a tweak on it. It's based off of a standard kind of communication style assessment, but it breaks people up into drivers, empathizers, analyzers, and socializers. And what I was noticing is that at least in this particular cohort, almost everybody was showing up in that socializer category, which is high assertiveness, high expressiveness, which I kind of expected it to be a bit more of a shotgun kind of looking thing where
Sure.
it's kind of a little bit of a balance. Certainly there'd probably be a propensity of people to be in that quadrant, but I was quite shocked at how many people were in there. And then I started going back over some of the older ones, and I saw the same sort of trend. And so again, that kind of reinforced this belief, misguided or otherwise, that I'm not leadership material, because I definitely don't see myself as being highly assertive and highly expressive. But it did get me thinking, like, shouldn't there be some people in there? And so that's when I started to kind of wrestle with the idea a little bit more and say, what would it take for me to feel like I could be a leader despite all these, beliefs or that sort of thing? And it started to occur to me that the term leader and the term leadership comes with a bucket load of baggage. And much of it is probably unhelpful, particularly because you have a lot of people that will make analogies to, the star athlete or the billion-dollar CEO or that sort of thing. And, while it's true that some of the people that we kind of put on the leadership pedestal might be demonstrating good leadership skills, more often than not, we're actually using it as a synonym for hero or, prodigy or just somebody who's really good at something, as opposed to necessarily leading other people. Mm-hmm. And so in sort of exploring that some more, I started recognizing, like, I'm probably not alone in this thought of, if somebody was to come in the room and say, who here would like to be a better leader, I'm going to be one of those people that sits on my hands so that nobody, inadvertently picks me to speak. And so it got me thinking, like, what would I have to do in order to change the narrative so that somebody like me would feel more comfortable putting my hand up and kind of identifying, like, if I'm reluctant to be a leader and other people might be in the same boat, how do we get, that self-assessment to start to center the results so that we see more of those other types showing up? And that's kind of what kicked off that entire cycle for me.
It's such a great story, and it makes me think of what brings up for me is a lot of over the last couple of years, a lot of my own personal kind of journey development work through both kind of professionally and with my therapist and in a bunch of different ways is recognizing how many stories I had about myself that I was living inside of. And those stories were really pervasive, and they were really convincing, and they were very, very difficult to confront and address and let go of. And what I'm struck by in you telling that story about this leader, and how quickly, like, one comment caused you to write a story about yourself that then became so resilient that it stuck for however long it was, a decade or more, and how easily and accidentally we could be doing that to people. I think about the kids. You hear stories about how kids are told when they're young that they're not a leader. Or you're on a sports team and you're told that, no, you're not the leader. You're not a leader. You're just a role player. Or you get a message, you get those messages and they become a story. And then that story causes you to opt out of all of these things, right? To see yourself. I mean, it's very difficult to try. I mean, I think there's a secondary lesson here is let's make sure if we're going to use our words, let's use our words to invite people up and create possibility as opposed to shutting it down. But that's not the conversation today. The conversation is, how do we engage with those that might have gotten this message from a lot of different ways that they can't or shouldn't be or aren't capable of being a leader, and then reprogram. And so I am really fascinated about once you started digging into this, what have you found in your work around where does it start, right? How do you begin? I guess there's a couple things I'm thinking about. One is, how do you recognize these reluctant leaders in a way that you can sort of find them and maybe try to invite them into rethinking or reframing themselves? And then I'm curious what then that sort of initial conversation, or even just the initial invite, because it sounds to me like, unless I'm reading your story wrong, you were probably pretty reluctant. Like if somebody had showed up and said, no, you're a leader. And you're like, no, I'm not. I'm really not. I told you I'm not. I'm not going to be a manager, because you had a story about what that meant. And so that's not an easy hill to get over. I mean, just finding those people and inviting them to reconsider is probably a part of the process that took a while to figure out, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I had a professor in university who had thrown out a line one time that kind of stuck with me, which is people, by and large, would prefer to be right than happy. And by that, like, once we kind of get really comfy in that really negative self-talk or the stories that we tell ourselves, the amount of effort involved in kind of pulling that out and then having to rebuild all of the other sort of thought processes that were built on top of that, it's a lot of work. But what's interesting to me is that, and this was my experience as well, is that there's usually some point, even with us reluctant leaders, where we say, what about more? Like, I want something more, even if it's something as superficial as saying, like, I need a bigger paycheck. Somewhere along the line, somebody says, I'm ready for more responsibility, more accountability. I want to grow in some way. And maybe that doesn't mean growing into management, but, the benefit that I know now is that growth can take on so many different paths, and leadership can be used in so many different modes, that you really don't have to necessarily take the traditional sort of moving up the corporate ladder approach, and more the other analogy that I like is that jungle gym analogy that I think Sheryl Sandberg maybe had sort of coined. But that notion of being able to kind of try out different things, and really when you break down true leadership, the most foundational mode of leadership is just to be able to go first and demonstrate to the rest of your team that a path is safe to take. So when you start going back to the fundamentals of things and decoupling it from all these extra unnecessary stories and the baggage that comes with a lot of this leadership talk, and you just get back to, what can I do for the person to the left and to the right of me, such that they're in a better situation today than they were yesterday, thanks to something that I did for them. If you can get into that, then life becomes a lot easier. And so kind of coming back to your questions in terms of, how do I identify others? I mean, it really kind of comes down to two things. One, the big red flag that goes up for me is if I happen to be within earshot of somebody that says, oh, I'm not leadership material. I don't have to know people anymore to say they've for sure got leadership material, because I'm a firm believer that everyone has leadership potential of some way, that can show up in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's as a manager, as a CEO, as just an amazing team lead, or just that one expert in the corner that, really knows how to talk people off the ledge when things get super hairy and that sort of thing. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that can show up. And when I hear people say, I'm not leadership material, that's usually my cue to kind of step in and share my story and help them see things differently. The other part is to kind of get rid of the language of leadership and say, if I look at any good leadership program, and I would like to think that, the stuff that we put together is world-class in its own right. But if we compare all these different leadership courses, all the skills that they teach are things that we recognize very quickly we can use outside of the workplace as well. And so we can use it at home, we can use it with our friends, what have you. And so that's when you realize, well, these are human skills. They're not just leadership skills. And so if you say, who here wants to be a better leader, you get that sort of reluctance from people. But if you say, who here wants to be a better human, now all of a sudden, most people are willing to put their hand up, because that sounds like something that anybody can do. And the reality is you're still teaching them these human skills that we've labeled as leadership skills. And by default, if they practice that stuff, I guarantee you in 2 years' time, I'm going to be able to tap somebody on the shoulder and point behind them to show them the line of people that have chosen to follow them. And so you can't help but trip over good leadership if you put these things into practice. And I would say that it's those reluctant leaders that I would probably trust even more, because they see all of the pros and cons of that role and the responsibility that's involved. And they probably weight it heavier than some lifetime leaders who may or may not be doing a great job. But with that responsibility, they're going to put a lot more attention into, doing what's right for the team.
Just out of curiosity, is there a part of the process that invites them to find where that limiting belief lives and confront it? like for you, it seems like you were able to kind of, at some point, you were able to track it back to the origin, find where it started, and then you've been able to kind of rewrite or reframe that. Like, okay, the way I took that, I could have taken that completely different. This isn't what leadership means. This is a bad leader. And that's a totally different narrative, right? You go into a completely different place. And so I'm curious, does it require helping them find and reframe that? Or is it just a matter of reframing just leadership in general for them?
I don't know if that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to it. I think both can be applicable. I know in the past, I'm a big believer in understanding the why behind things. That's kind of comes from the troubleshooter in me. And I think that there is value in having that conversation. But at the same time, I wouldn't want the inability to kind of trace it back to a single origin point to kind of prevent, what comes next. And so ultimately, I think what can be really beneficial is for people to just accidentally find themselves or if they're going through a program like this, kind of intentionally find themselves in a situation where they're outperforming their expectations. And then once they have that aha moment of, oh, well, look at me, I'm actually doing it, then it might be easier to kind of go back. But sometimes I think that, as important as understanding the why is, I think the what next question is probably more important in that case.
Well, and the reality is too that some of that probably would require you to get into the therapy business, because I'm sure some of it probably starts in their childhood with their parents, and that's not the business you want to be in. And so they can do that work with their therapist, hopefully, but we'll find a better path for them forward. So I guess before we leave this topic, I love that idea. You're finding and inviting people in. Have you found that? I mean, the other thing that strikes me from the story you were telling earlier was that you had, I think there's the reluctancy issue of leaders, but it also sounds to me too, like it makes sense to me that because social styles are the ones that, rightly or not, they're putting themselves forward. They're more visible, they're more engaged often. And so you're going to see introverts are not going to be as visible. I mean, I think that happens in every organization where if you have a highly social style, you're going to be more likely to show up on the radar of the leaders that are making the decision about nominating people to go to leadership training. And so how have you made sure that that's not the case as you've moved forward when you're selecting cohorts or when you're identifying these people to invite them up? Because I'm assuming these reluctant leaders are harder to find because they're probably not as self-promoting or not as social or not as whatever. So have you found that your cohorts have gotten more mixed in those sort of styles that you're talking about? And what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think what we've seen with that one assessment in particular, that it really has been kind of drawn more to the center. Interestingly, there's been a bit of a blip sort of pre and post COVID. And I think some of that comes from we've got, this massive cohort of new people within the organization that have just been hired within the last, 3-4 years. But I think now that people are starting to be exposed to the messaging again, and we see sort of that trend reemerging, I think a lot of it does come from changing the way that we talk about it and helping people appreciate there's different ways to show up. The other part, and maybe this is the troubleshooter in me, I do take a lot of care to kind of pull apart the terms that get used to say, who is traditionally, so to speak, a leader and who isn't. And the term that you raised, which is an important one, introverts. I think that, one of the things that I've kind of taken the time to better understand, because I definitely self-identify as an introvert, but I notice that a lot of CEOs do as well. And so I think that this is one of those ones where the term has kind of become all-encompassing to mean, maybe also super shy or super reluctant to engage in a social way, whereas it might just be, at the end of the day, we get our energy from being on our own and recharging that way versus an extrovert that gets their energy from being around a lot of people. And so it's really in kind of pulling apart all these different influences, so to speak, that contribute to that model that we use for what is and what isn't a leader. And so taking a look at that kind of stuff, as I say, like I think by changing the narrative within the organization and now kind of trying to share that as much as I can on, LinkedIn or whatever network people are willing to listen to me for a hot minute, it's being able to sort of change the conversation a bit so that people can relate to it better, and kind of really appreciating that it just starts with that everyday leadership and just kind of getting back to fundamentals, because very few super well-known leaders, I would say, probably started at that, expert level and jump straight into it. Winston Churchill, I'm sure, had a whole lot of fumbles along the road before he kind of became the person who he was known for. And odds are it probably started with, am I taking care of my team? And so you don't have to kind of build the world overnight. And so the path is just take that first step and see where that leads you. And kind of, the big thing that we do talk about a lot, we get into psychological safety and safety and belonging and that kind of stuff. But it's really about appreciating that all of that stuff isn't designed to make you more comfortable. It's designed to make it possible for you to be more uncomfortable or get over that initial threshold to push yourself outside of the comfort zone. Not so far that you go into full retreat, but just far enough so that you can kind of test the fence and realize that, you can pull this off and kind of build incrementally that experience to appreciate the capacity that you have. And then hopefully people just kind of get hooked on that, experience of, oh, I just crossed another threshold and now another one. And so if we take that language of leader and leadership off the table for a bit and just focus on the skills and the experiences and the responsibilities, I think that it really does help to kind of allow people to kind of self-select into that kind of learning path or growth and development path.
Well, I love the kind of call to action here. And I think it's a good call to action probably for every organization, is to just think more broadly about who you're cultivating or who you're identifying as your leaders, because there are some people, for whatever reason, that have great capabilities that just aren't going to raise their hand for a whole bunch of different reasons. And we have to help them get over that in order to invite them into developing those skills. And so I think that's a really, really great challenge.
And even to reframe that slightly, I would say it's probably because, thinking about who we are nominating or who we are kind of tapping to sort of step into the spotlight is part of it. But the other question on the table, the flip side of that, is who aren't we identifying? And I think that, as business leaders, I think that's probably the more important question, particularly in this age where we want to hear from a more diverse audience and be able to sort of challenge a company's blind spots and set up the conditions for success for innovation, is if we've been listening to the same type of person over and over again, who aren't we listening to? And so to be able to say, well, what if, for argument's sake, everybody in my organization has leadership skills that we need to be developing, then I think that really unlocks some amazing potential. And one of the other kind of linchpin pieces of research that I kind of set me on this path, we so often hear people say, oh, you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen or, too many leaders on the team. And I was listening to this talk done by a woman named Lauren Blackwell Landon. She works for NASA, or did at the time anyway. She was doing a talk for Google Rework and talked about this concept called proactive followership. So, briefly, astronauts themselves are all amazing leaders. Like if you're doing a schoolyard pick for leaders and there's an astronaut available, you're going to trip over yourself trying to get them on your team. And problem with a NASA mission is everybody's an astronaut, which means you've got teams full of leaders. So how do you manage that? And so she talks about this thing about proactive followership, which is partly recognizing like this situation needs more of me, so I'm going to step up, but then also recognizing when the situation needs more of somebody else or more specifically less of me. And so I'm going to conspicuously hand that leadership over to, somebody else on the team so that they can be the specialist of the moment. And so once you realize that choreography is possible within a team, there's no reason why you can't turn everybody on as a leader at some time during a project or in the workflow in order to really maximize the potential of the entire organization.
It's a great way to frame and describe that. I'm sure that's a great teaching mechanism, proactive followership. That's really nice. All right, so let's transition. That I appreciate you sharing all that. I think that's a really nice way to kind of transition out of that and leave us with kind of a call to action to think more broadly about leadership. And maybe and I love how you're sort of challenging us. I mean, your notion, the idea that leadership can be humanship, which sort of means that you view all humans, sort of being human, as having some sort of innate leadership potential, capability, whatever, responsibility. I love that. So I would love to spend another 2 hours digging into that, but we have not that much time today. So I do have a couple more quick questions that I ask everyone as we transition out of our conversation. And the first one is about kind of difficulties or challenges. So Will, what's a big challenge you are facing or wrestling with at work today?
Yeah, I would say it's, and I don't know if this is an artifact of being in the travel industry. The way I kind of describe the travel industry's experience during COVID, if we weren't right in the middle of the crater that it created, we were certainly crater adjacent. And so as a result, we've been through the rebuild mode and we're thriving again, which is great, but there's still a lot of multiple hat wearing. And so when you want to engage people to say, like, you're capable of doing more, one of the challenges that comes just kind of psychologically these days is like, I don't have capacity for more right now. Like, I'm already doing a million different things. And so the challenge that I'm trying to tackle right now is how can we kind of look at the learning or the experiential side of this a little bit differently so that we can kind of slide it into the work that we're doing already. Right now I've kind of set myself a mission to be able to say that I want our employer brand promise to be simply by choosing to work for G Adventures, you're going to increase your leadership capacity just by the way that we do things around here. And so I'm actively trying to sort of pull apart the nuts and bolts of what that looks like in order to say, how can we take this thing that used to be discrete learning and make it more on the job learning, while also recognizing that the managers that are going to need to take an active role in this process are also at capacity too. And so I don't have any great answers for that yet, but it's definitely one of the bigger challenges that we're wrestling with right now.
It strikes me that you might find some of the answers in the new kind of incredible AI tools we have burgeoning, right? That's where the amplification component of this is really intriguing, I think, in the AI conversation. So I'll be anxious to follow how you fix that, because I have high confidence that you're going to do something extremely cool. And so maybe we'll come back in another year or so and talk about how you sorted that out.
Looking forward to that.
All right. So last big question for you, and this is one I love to ask because it's really just kind of a hopeful question about the future. So, Will, when you think about work, big W work, right? Work broadly, 5 years from today, what's one thing that you hope will be different about it than is today?
I mean, you've kind of touched on it there with that AI comment. I would say, we're at a precipice where things are going to get weird and I'm old enough to remember the days when the internet was becoming a thing and everybody was saying, like, are we interneting yet? Do we have our site on the interwebs? And nobody really knew what they were doing, but they heard all the catchphrases and they felt like they were falling behind if they weren't doing something. And that whole situation rhymes a lot with what people are going through today. And I think the worry is this rush towards AI, which I think offers amazing potential, also runs the risk of dehumanizing a lot of work. And I think really I think the people that are doing mediocre work just for a paycheck, I think they really are at risk in terms of losing their job, because AI, at least in its current incarnation, is really good at mediocre work. And so I think that what's really going to separate the good from the great going forward is understanding how to leverage those tools in a way where you're freeing up more headspace for the people in your organization to do more human work with your human customers. And so, certainly in our space with travel, it is a deeply human product in a lot of ways. Like, we are connecting cultures and we are connecting people to communities. And yet we are busy, and so we need to figure out like how do we take the tools and mitigate all of the rote work so that we can free people up to do the more creative and not necessarily creative in a generative way, but just creative in terms of like how can I connect with this person on a more personalized basis and really bring out the best possible experience that would suit this one traveler or this batch of travelers. And so my hope is that in 5 years' time, we'll have kind of thrown all the spaghetti at the wall and figured out what sticks. And then from there, leverage the tools to kind of free up a lot of the numerical logistics and that kind of thing, so that we can focus on, the people that are involved, both the travelers, the communities that we're visiting, the suppliers, and our own staff.
It's like more fully tap human potential.
Absolutely, yeah. And the irony is that it lies on the other side of this technology, and so I think it's a really great opportunity to kind of figure out how can we reconfigure the tools so that we're not reconfiguring ourselves to work better with them. Yeah,
beautifully full circle, Will. So I appreciate that. Thank you for that. I like to end with a one-word check out. So in one word, how are you feeling as we wrap up our conversation today?
I mean, I'd have to go with optimistic. I think, I'm in a lot of ways, I tend to be pessimistic or plan for the worst and hope for the best. But, when it comes to human potential right now and really, as many sources of turbulence we see in the world today, fundamentally, it does come down to people are looking for a new sense of connection and community. And the work that we do at G Adventures has been so rewarding in that regard that I really do get a chance to kind of see past the headlines and see past the noise that tells us otherwise, and see that, if you're just a small community in rural Peru and you get super excited to see 12 guests come and get excited to see you, there's something magical about that. And so I think, that optimism about where we're going as human beings, I feel really good about that.
When I'll say my one word from today's conversation is challenged. And I feel challenged because I think I'm recognizing that I don't think I've been as strong an advocate as I need to be for those reluctant leaders. And so this conversation really helped shine kind of a light into that spot for me to pay closer attention to that and I think be a better advocate. So thank you for that. That's a gift.
And thank you for that feedback. That's very helpful.
Well, thanks for this conversation. I knew it would be good. I from the conversations that we've had over the years about your work, I have always been intrigued by your organization and the work you do. This was really generous and I love the perspective. So thank you so much for making the time to share.
It's been my pleasure, and it's been a great conversation. So thank you.
So if people want to connect with you, where is the best place for people to find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, these days it's easiest to find me on LinkedIn. Just Will Matthews, look for G Adventures. If you find a big goofy smile, that's probably me. If not, then it might be a different Will Matthews because there's a lot of us out there. But yeah, Will Matthews at G Adventures on LinkedIn.
And if people are, as I am, sort of motivated to go poke around on the G Adventures vacations and adventures, where do they go for that?
Yeah, as simple as gadventures.com. So just the letter G, then the word adventures.com. And you'll be able to find, I think these days we're just shy of 1,000 tours to all 7 continents, including Antarctica. So be sure to check it out.
That's awesome. Well, I will put all the links in the show notes, so make it easy for you to find. And well, this was great. And thank you for listening today. I hope you can take some of the insights here. I hope that you will go back and look at your workforce differently. So look at everyone. When you start, I think as Will is challenging us, seeing everyone as a leader, then maybe you'll start to see pockets of people that you've been missing entirely because you weren't seeing them as leaders. They weren't seeing themselves as leaders, and that will open up a whole world of opportunity. So I hope you can take that back, make a difference, throw a spark, find some of those reluctant leaders and invite them into the party. And please remember to check in with those people who matter most to you. Right? That may be the most important thing that you can do today. Till next time.